Well, how do you know what I'm in now? Good evening again. We got a notice that there was some error in our effort to go live, and we didn't go live when we should have gone live. So we're going to continue with the book of Esther. And as I was saying, was that I try to empathize with the people that we're reading about in the scriptures, because the purpose of those accounts of things that happen to real people in real time is for our learning, that we, through patience and understanding of the scriptures, might have hope. It's also important that as we see them make decisions to deal with certain situations and they make the wrong decisions, then we would learn from, as somebody told me years ago, I don't know who, that you got to learn from other people's mistakes because you won't live long enough to make them all yourself. And sometimes I look back on my life and I think, well, I did a pretty good job of trying to do them all myself, but that isn't really true. There have been hundreds of mistakes that I could have made that I didn't make, and I'm sure there's been many that I made that I should not have made, but that's why they're here. They're here so that we can learn from them. And part of learning from other people's mistakes is empathizing rather with the things that they undoubtedly felt as they traveled through life in whatever situations they had to face. In our following Esther through the book of Esther, she's gone through quite a bit, actually. When you look at her life, she was, as a child, orphaned, and that's not a very positive thing for very many people. It might have been if things were really bad with her parents, but in most cases, that's not a positive thing. She was raised by a cousin, and that could or could not be a positive thing. It all depends on the situations, but for her, it was, I believe, a very positive thing. And from what we read, as we read about the way she faces life as she becomes an adult and finally becomes a wife of a king and the queen of a country, that she really seemed to handle herself very well, very mature. And in the part of the story that we're going to look at this evening, I would say that it's the part of the story where many of the challenges that her life prepared her for came to the point that she could deal with a really, really critical combination of negatives. Whatever negative or positive it was in her losing her parents at a young age and then being raised, her part of the tribe of the nation Israel was in captivity, taken captive. The grandparents of her and her cousin were taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar, and they were still there in that land, that country. And it was at a time when King Ahasuerus was the king, and they were in a situation where, without going through the story again, he decided to separate himself from his wife, no longer have her as a king, and in time he decided he wanted another wife or queen, to function as a queen as he was the king. And so somebody came up with the idea in his courthouse or his cabinet or something, that the wise thing to do would be to round up all of the beautiful virgins in the area and actually I don't know if the whole country, but certainly in the area and a large part of the country, and have them be trained and taken care of for a year, and then spend one night with him, and then he would decide after that whether he wanted to have any more to do with them or not. Well, that's the whole thing is just a little bit traumatic. We think about people falling in love and they get married loving each other, and they have a degree of knowledge of each other's, personally knowledge of each other from visiting and talking and communicating. And then one of them suggests that maybe they should get married. Typically, it's the man that asks the woman to marry him. And they do. And hopefully, as the years go by, their marriage will be sweeter. They'll get to know each other better, and they'll be able to work the rough spots off of their personalities on each other. And they hopefully will have children, and they'll bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. But in this case, you spend a year being, I guess, anointed would be the way to say it, with one form of myrrh, and then another time you're another herb, and these are for your physical beauty and cleansing. And I am assuming that there would be some training to be the queen of the land, and some idea as to what the king of the land was going to want from you as a woman and as a wife and queen. But so Esther went through all of that, and she becomes the queen. And then there's a gentleman that has become the number 2 man under her husband, the king, and his name is Haman. Haman's not an uncommon thing to find Hamans, that type of people, that personality, that outlook on life. For the nation Israel was not an uncommon thing for them to find. Today, the nation Israel finds themselves in a position where there are people who would fit the role of Haman very nicely. And they sometimes are talking about what they want. They want that land that Israel is occupying a portion of. I hear an expression from sea to shining sea. Well, Haman would have fit in well in that environment of people. In Esther chapter 3, Haman had gone to the king because he was pretty upset about Mordecai, the man who raised Esther, and the fact that he wouldn't bow to him and scrape before him, since even though he was the number 2 man of the kingdom. And so he goes to the king and asks for a decree, and the king says, go ahead, you write it. But what he wanted to do was exterminate these people that he reported to the king had different laws than the nation that King Ahasuerus was king over. They have different laws, and he added that, and they don't obey your laws. Well, that was probably true. The point that he probably maybe only knew anything specific about was that one of the things that the king had said was that people were to bow to Haman, and Mordecai was not bowing to Haman. So a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded to the kings, the satraps, the governors that were over every province, to the officials of the people, to every province according to its script, and to every people's in their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus. It was written and sealed with the king's signet ring, and the letters were sent by couriers unto all the king's provinces. Now then, that wouldn't, in most cases, probably bother the queen at all, or she probably wouldn't even get too interested in it. But as it turned out, Esther was, of course, a Jew, an Israelite. She had been advised by her cousin Mordecai not to reveal that fact to anybody, and she hadn't, out of her respect and appreciation for Mordecai. And so it wouldn't have made any immediate difference anyway, unless somebody talked later on. But the point of this decree that Haman put together and had written in every language and spread to every part of every corner of the nation was, quote, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate. Okay, that's 3 points. And it's interesting, there's a number of 3 points that are made in this discourse. But that's 3 things: to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate. I think anybody would get the message that this, whoever this is talking about, we want them done away with. Destroyed, killed, annihilated. And the text says to destroy, kill, and to annihilate all the Jews. And in case you don't understand what all the Jews is, it states both young and old, little children and women. That's pretty complete. Young and old, little children and women in one day. So this was one day of annihilation, or one day to annihilate, to the best of their ability, all of these people that had been taken from the land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob into the land of Persia, basically. And they were to be killed in one day. And on a specific one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to plunder their possessions. So they were all to be killed, and their possessions were to be taken away from them. That's the content of the document that was distributed throughout that nation, that was relevant to Esther due to the fact that she was one of those people. She was one of the Jews that lived in that land. And the 14th verse of the 3rd chapter of the book of Esther says a copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people, that they should be ready for that day. So on every Jew and every Gentile that wanted to kill Jews would be looking forward to a day when they were told that they should destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews. And as I said, that's not far at all from the attitude of some people today in the world in which we live. Some people today, even in the United States of America, which as a nation has been very supportive of Jews as long as it was officially recognized by the other nations on the earth as a nation, and a portion of the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they've been allowed, and in some cases others have been forced to allow them to live in some portions of it. That's been the history since about somewhere in the 1940s. And there are people, were then, there are now, people that would go right along with Haman's decree that they should be killed, destroyed, and annihilated, all of them. Both young and old, little children and women. And there's been times when there were people killed across that spectrum of population. And they would like for that to be some kind of a worldwide law, some people would, in the world in which we live today, to do away with the nation Israel. But think about Esther, because that's what we're talking about. If you had been born into this world and lost fairly young in life, very young in life, as best I understand, as a child, the two most important things that a person has in their life at that point, and that's your parents. You lost them both. How they were lost, we're not told specifically, or at least as far as I know, we're not told specifically. Uh, you were befriended by a cousin who raised you as a father would raise a daughter, and you respected him, and he cared for you, and he looked after you, and he advised you, and as you were selected to become queen, he was always in the out in front of the building in which you were housed and did what he could to maintain contact and to let you know he was concerned and with you and for you. And now you are about to lose everything, including your own life. Now, then, the fact that up at this point nobody knew you were Jew, you weren't personally threatened by anybody or considered to be in line for being exterminated or annihilated by anybody. But the odds are very good that somebody would find out that you were really a Jew, and then what? So the uncertainty, the fear, the anguish almost at the prospects of even if I were to survive, what about my cousin that raised me up, an older man that, and what about others of my nation and my people? And again, what about the promises of God's protection and all? And yet there's going to be a decree that was issued in the name of the king, and I'm his queen, and I'm scheduled to be annihilated. That's pretty shaky, pretty scary. But like I say, as the story develops, at first she's not really aware of that, but that decree has been spread and is being spread. Because we're told in verse 15 of chapter 3 that the couriers went out, they hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan the citadel. So not only was it spread all over the country, but it was right there in the city where the king's quarters were and the queen's housing was, and where her training had taken place in preparation to be queen, right there where she was. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. In other words, apparently everybody wondered what's going on, because the Jews had lived there. They'd lived there and basically become somewhat settled and at peace with the nations around them, and the people around them. And yet there's all of a sudden this decree that on the 13th day of the first month, they're going to be annihilated. And so in chapter 4, moving through the book, Mordecai, when he learned and what had happened, he reacts. And he reacts typical, I guess, to people in that civilization, in that culture at that time. He's shocked. He's grieved. He's somewhat anxious for not only himself, but everybody that is a child of Israel. And so we read in verse 1 to 4 of chapter 4 that he tears his clothes and he puts on sackcloth, which is probably something most of us, I've seen it in years gone by, but don't see it very often and haven't seen it in many years at all. But it's generally a rough piece of material that's made out of yarns that's fairly rough, made threads of something, some kind of material. Could be cotton, could be lots of different things. But and so they put on this rough cloth gown, garment, or whatever you want to call it, and robe, and he puts ashes all over himself, and he goes into the middle of the city, and he cries with a loud and a bitter cry. He's really distressed, distraught, and understandably so. And he went as far as the front of the king's gate. And he didn't go any farther because the text says that no one can enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. So he couldn't go in. If he wanted to see Esther, he couldn't go like that. The guards probably wouldn't even let him get started. And so that's all the farther he went. And then we read that in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, which was supposed to be everywhere, there was great mourning among the Jews. Mourning for weeping, crying, sighing, anticipation of dying, really, with fasting. In other words, they didn't eat, and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. And I would say up to this point, as I understand the story, Esther's pretty much oblivious to what all's going on. But then in verse 4 of Esther chapter 4, Esther's maids, we read, and her eunuchs came and told her. And the queen was deeply distressed, it says, deeply distressed. And so then apparently she wanted to talk to Mordecai, and so she knows that he can't come in or get close dressed in sackcloth. So she sent garments to him, clothing to Mordecai, and told him to take his sackcloth away. Told them to take away his sackcloth and give him this other clothes to wear. But he wasn't up for that at all. He didn't go for it at all. And so then Esther calls a eunuch who was appointed to attend her by the name of Hattach, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was. In other words, she was getting enough information to know something was happening, but she wanted information from somebody, as I see it and read it, that she trusted, Mordecai. And so Hattach goes to Mordecai in the city square in front of the king's gate. And we read in verse 7 that Mordecai told him what was going on, told him about the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the privilege of having the Jews destroyed. He gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he could show it to Esther and explain it to her. And his goal was to motivate Esther to command her to go to the king and make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. And I don't know how old Esther was. I maybe could sort it out some way, at least get some idea, but I don't really know. Maybe she was 20, maybe she was in her 30s. I don't know. Maybe she was younger than that. I really don't know. But when I think about her, what she's been through to become queen, and now she, as queen, is faced with this challenge of a deadline for her and the life of all other Jews under Mordecai. Their life is only supposed to last until the 13th of the first month, so it's very limited. And then she's being asked to go to the king and plead with the king for her people. And in my mind, that's a pretty big load. That's a pretty big load. I mean, her people are wailing and weeping and wearing sackcloth and putting ashes on themselves. They're lying prostrate in different places, apparently, because of the grief, the sorrow, the fear that they expected to be killed, to die. And she's the closest one that would apparently have any possible way of helping out. as far as having the ear of King Ahasuerus. So as that account goes on in chapter 4, this servant of hers, Hathach, returned and tells her what Mordecai has to say. And then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command to Mordecai. And she said, look, I got a problem. Anybody that, just because I'm the queen, I don't get to go walk into where the king's palace is, or king's seat is, and talk to him just because I want to. All the kings, this is the way she describes the situation, all the king's servants and the people of the king's province know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death. This was a security measure that reflects somewhat probably on the fear that the king operated under all the time. If people just came walking in, it may be one of them was an assassin of some kind. And so if you walked in uninvited into the inner part of the area, you died. And there's one exception. And the exception is that if the king holds out the golden scepter, then you may live. And then she adds to that information that she passes on to her cousin Mordecai, yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So I don't know that means they haven't been with each other to talk or communicate at all for the 30 days, or she's never gone before the king that way, therefore would be treated that way. I don't know exactly what that's saying, but I'm inclined to think it's saying, well, there's never been any opportunity for me to have any private conversation with the king for 30 days. And so if I walk and I picture that as like a house with a large living room, you might say, or sometimes we call them a formal living room, I guess, in some houses, and a large entry in the front, and you get to the front door, and if the guy opens the door and he asks you if you have I don't know what you had, a password or a note from the king, or he knew already who you were, and if your name was on the list, you could come in, no question. Or maybe he says, well, but your name's not on the list. And you say, yeah, but I got to see the king. Yeah, but you know that if you go in and he's not interested in seeing you, you're a dead man or woman. You're dead. It's all over. It's quick. That's the situation she was in. So she doesn't really know whether she could even get to the king. She may die trying. I don't know whether that's where the phrase came, I'm going to die trying, but that's what the fact was, that she might die trying. Now then, it's really critical when you read this account. To me, it's critical that you have to realize God has promised some things to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the children of Israel, the Jews. God has promised some things to them, and he's following through, and he is still today following through on promises that he made to them that haven't been kept yet, completed yet. He still is. But I think that it would be so beneficial to political leaders if they would read the book of Esther and believe that there is a God that looked after Israel in the time of Esther, in the situation where that portion of Israel that was under the reign of King Ahasuerus was were threatened at this point and actually promised by law, according to law, to be killed as of a certain date. And God's not going to let it happen. It's not going to happen. And Mordecai was by far not even close. I mean, that's probably significantly further down the road. It's probably at least almost 3,000 years ago that this happened. And God was looking after those people. And in this case, just a segment of those people in this one little country, but God's looking after them. And so things are going to happen that Esther's going to be able to do, and she will attempt to do, have the courage to try to do, to take the risks that you might say she has to take in order to do what needs to be done, and that's appeal to the king for the nation Israel that he has control over. And so she says, this is the odds. All of the bad things that have happened to me since after I was born, they still seem to be stacking up on me. I myself haven't been called to see the king for 30 days. So they told Mordecai what Esther had to say. And so Mordecai gave an answer back to Esther. And it's kind of an exhortation, maybe even kind of a rebuke, but he tells Esther, don't think in your heart that you'll escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews, because if you remain, and he also goes on to say, if you remain completely silent at this time, thinking that you're going to be able to save your own hide, so to speak, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. See, it's interesting that Mordecai, he says, Esther is, if you think that just by being quiet, you're going to slide through this and not get hurt, that's not going to happen. But on the other hand, if you're not willing to take the risk, motivated by your love for God and your confidence in his word and the nation Israel, your brothers and sisters, if you're not willing to take the chance, then God's going to relieve us, going to protect us, going to look after us from some other place. And he goes on to add, but you and your father's house will perish. And then adds another thought. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for just such a time as this? In other words, when you look back on your life, Esther, for you to come from being a poor orphan to being the queen of the land, it may be that's why God saw fit to see you promoted to this place for this time and this day and this need. And I think as Esther goes, as we go on in the book of Esther, as Esther appeals in this situation, I think it's important to look at the way people communicate, because Mordecai isn't really demanding that she do it, but he's certainly strongly suggesting that she do it, and he's strongly implying that if you don't do it, thinking that you're going to save your hide, it isn't going to work. But in fact, really, we don't have such a desperate situation that that Israel isn't going to be protected where we need to be protected, because if you're not willing, somebody else will. God will raise up somebody else that will do it. And then reminds her of the fact that, it may well be, because you've had such a rise, you might say, in your social status, that it's almost hard to believe that it would happen to somebody. And maybe that's the reason God blessed you that way. That you're in a position now that you can be used of God as the one that was able to protect the nation Israel, that portion of it, in that situation. In other words, he's trying to build the case that'll help her to work through her fears and her own. We all have a predisposition to protect ourselves, self-defense. And so in response to that, in the 4th chapter and verse 15, Esther sends a reply back to Mordecai. And so this is what she tells Mordecai to do and the other Jews. Gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan. That's where the kingdom reigned, the throne of King Ahasuerus was. And fast for me, don't eat. Fast, deprive yourselves. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day, for 3 days. And then she says, my maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. In other words, the business of not showing up in the outer court, or the inner court rather, and uninvited and expecting to live through it, was because you violated the law. You're not supposed to do that. And she says, if I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish. And so Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him, and she went her way and did what was asked of her. And on the 3rd day, with chapter 5, we're moving forward in the story, it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So she was where, unless she'd been invited before she came, she was not supposed to go. And if she went, her only hope was that when the king saw her, he would not ignore her, because if he had ignored her, it would have been off with his head. Later, with her head, excuse me. Later on in the account, it's interesting, when Haman is finally who he was and what he was all about became obvious. There's an expression, and we'll look at it when we get there, but they covered his head. And I've read that for years, thought about it for years. What I think that is that there may be 2 guards would approach you, one from one side, one from the other side. One of them had a sack big enough that they could flip it over your head, down over your shoulders, tie your arms to your side, and that you neither could see, hear, and to fight, there was no chance. And they marched you out, or carried you out, probably marched you out. And I don't know whether they took the sack off or not. But anyway, in this case, that would be the end of your life. That would, whatever you saw before your head was covered, that was the last thing you saw in this life. And so that's the situation that Esther's in at this point. That's. I mean, it takes a lot of commitment, a lot of, I don't know whether courage is the right word, a lot of confidence in God in this case, and his promises to Israel in this case, even though they were in captivity at this time as a nation and as tribes of the nation, because they sinned against God. And he'd promised them that if they sinned against God, there was going to be a price to pay. He was going to curse things, and things were not going to go well. And that's where they were living. But still, he promised to not let anybody take them out either completely. So she does what she needs to do. The third day, after they fasted and prayed, Esther put on her royal robes, stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sits on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was, it says, the text says, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight. Okay, who affects our thoughts sometimes? Who motivates us to think one way or the other? Well, there's two spirits that work on all of us at times. There's Satan, and then there's the Spirit of God. And I don't think it's any trick at all for God to modify the emotions, the thoughts, the feelings that King Ahasuerus potentially could have towards someone that entered the inner area of the throne room and was not invited in advance. And when he looked at her standing in the court, she finds favor in his sight. I think God had something to do with that. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you up to half the kingdom." Now, that's an expression that's often quoted coming from kings and people in that kind of a situation. And I've always wondered if they really mean that they would give that person, if it's a queen, the queen, half the kingdom, if that's what she asked for? Or is that just one of those things like when people ask us, "Well, how you doing?" "Oh, I'm doing fine." Well, what's that mean? It really means nothing. It may mean I don't want to tell you how I feel, you know. But it's. I wonder if it's not an expression like that really doesn't carry a commitment. It's just an expression. But anyway, that was his expression. That's a very positive expression. And it's interesting. I spent a fair amount of time this afternoon because things been going around here away. My thoughts have been jammed up with a lot of things, but thinking about Esther in anticipation of right now, and what the fear that she must have had, the anxiety, I mean, if you get a chance to talk, what are you going to say? How quickly can you get the point across? How would you? Will tears be what brings you to have empathy for my people and for my life and what's happening, or what should I do? And I think the tendency would be for someone that could get this far, and you might say this endeavor, to try to make an appeal for the nation Israel in the ears of King Ahasuerus, that Haman had motivated him to sign a decree declaring that they should be exterminated, would just be to jump in and talk how wonderful the Jews are, how there's been somebody trying to kill them off, that you can't do this. This is a terrible thing. I'm your queen, but I'm actually one of those people that they want to kill. Man, I don't have long, and I don't know what's going to be the end result. So I'm going to say as much as I can and pitch as hard as I can. Maybe that's what she thought of. Maybe that's only a thought that I would have, but that would be my thought. Should I do it that way, or should I do it some other way? Is there some other way that I could build a rapport or an empathy with me, or reminding him of what we've got together as king and queen and husband and wife? How am I going to do this? And to me, it's really interesting how she did it, because it's not probably the way I would come up with. And so the king says, what do you want, Esther? I give you anything, including half the kingdom. Well, he sounded like he was in a very good mood and very generous feeling. And so Esther answered and says, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for him. Well, that's completely off subject. No, it's not off subject. It's recognizing the fact that I don't want to just rush in and start pitching my fears and my anxiety and my disappointments and frustrations and try to convince you of the benefit of the Jewish people to you and your nation. And I don't want to do that. I want to build some kind of rapport so that we can have some opportunities. Maybe I'd like for us to have time to visit together, talk together. And she had the courage to invite not just the king, but the king and Haman. And it would be really hard not to think that dirty, low-down skunk. He goes around here acting like he's a wonderful, happy-go-lucky guy, and he's doing good for everybody and helping the king, and he's trying to destroy all of the Jews. So how can I best do this? Well, so she chooses to invite them to come, as it turns out, as I read the account, that afternoon to a banquet that is actually a banquet of wine that she prepared for them. So the king said, bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther said. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. No pitch at all for the cause at hand. She's just being friendly, kind. And so they get to the banquet of wine that's a little bit later in the day. And the king says again to Esther, what is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. And it shall be done. Well, he's already made a commitment to do anything she wants up to half the kingdom. Now, then it's interesting that actually what they need to do, he can't do directly. He can't do it directly because he can't reverse the decree that was made and passed into law by Haman being allowed by the king to do that in the king's name, the law of the Medes and the Persians. It couldn't be reversed. So he really couldn't do that. If she'd have put it that way, would you reverse that law? He would say, I can't do it. I can't do it. But she's not getting that. She's working on building the rapport, reminding him of what we have of value together. And so he says again, whatever you want, you have the kingdom. And so she responds in chapter 5, starting with verse 7, my petition and request is this. Okay, here it comes, you might think, but it doesn't. If I have found favor, and listen to the build-up. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, well, obviously she had. She was queen. Number 2, if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to a banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. She doesn't pitch the problem at all again. And she invites Haman again. And it isn't that she doesn't know what to pitch, and it isn't that she doesn't know how to say it, and it isn't that she can't talk, because when she does finally make the pitch, she does a very nice job of it. But think of what think of the control of her spirit, the gentle and quiet spirit that is a prerequisite to inviting somebody that it could have such a tremendous result in your life and the life of all of your brothers and sisters. And she's just inviting them to banquets. And so the next thought in chapter 5 and starting with 9 is Haman going out that day joyful and with a glad heart. And he's really in, and he's really in tight, and he's been invited to a banquet of wine, and then at the banquet of wine he was invited to a banquet for the next day. He's really in tight, he thinks. Another side of this story that we can learn from is when you think everything's going your way and you're in tight, you may not be at all. You may be about at the end of your rope. And it may be that God's going to bring it up short, or everything's going to fall apart, or whatever. You never know. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and that he did not tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. What's going on in a man's heart that just because another man won't tremble before him and doesn't bow and scrape before him, it makes you just terribly upset? And the 10th verse says he restrained himself, went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the kings had promoted him, and how he advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king. And Haman said, and besides all that, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet. He doesn't have a clue what's going on. Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow I'm again invited by her along with the king. Man, that's great. But then his bitter heart against Mordecai comes to surface, and he said, yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate. So all of his, and you know, what kind of people want to sit around and listen to a guy bragging about all he's done and what he's been promoted to and how wonderful things they are and how his social life at work is? Except then there's this guy Mordecai that's outside the temple. But they're there, and they're his friends and his wife. And so his friends and his wife said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the mornings go into King Medar and ask the king to suggest that Mordecai be hanged on it, and then go merrily to the banquet. Well, they don't know that they're suggesting that she go kill Esther's cousin / father. They don't have a clue. But they think just go to the banquet with Esther and everything will be fine. But they don't know a lot of what's going on. And it's true in life that a lot of times we don't know what's going on. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows built. And I'm going to run out of time before I get done. But that night, the king couldn't sleep. Well, I wonder why that is. Well, I think because God is working behind the scenes. And I say that in part because I believe, I have no doubt that God today is working behind the scenes so that nobody is going to succeed in killing, exterminating the nation Israel from off the face of the earth. It's not going to happen. And there'll be things happening in the lives of different people that have played and will play different roles in the history that's being built today. And they will come through it and prosper yet. But that night, in this case, the king couldn't sleep. And so they were reading the Chronicles to him. And there was an account of Mordecai telling that two of the people that were keepers of the door, Bigthana and Teresh, doorkeepers, got angry with King Ahasuerus and wanted to lay hands on him. And Mordecai had reported it to Esther, who reported it to the king, and it was examined, and those men were caught, and they were killed, and they didn't hurt the king. And so the king said, "What honor and dignity has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this?" And the king's servant who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." And then somebody was outside the court, and so the king says, "Who's outside the court?" And they said, "Oh, that's Haman. Just entered the outer court of the king's palace." And he came along with the intent in his mind to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows. Isn't that a coincidence? They've just read the account in the Chronicles of the king that Mordecai had saved the king's life, and now Haman shows up with a request that he hang Mordecai on his gallows. And so the king's servant said to them, "Haman's standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So he comes in. And so then the king asked Haman a question. "What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Okay, put this all together with Haman. What kind of person would be asked a question like that and immediately think, "Oh, he wants to honor me"? Or immediately have an answer because you answer what you would want done for you, and you think that's what's going to happen. Instead, what's going to happen is Mordecai is going to get the honor that Haman wishes he got, and Haman's going to have to give it to him. And so Haman answers. I mean, I would think you'd ask, "Well, I kind of need to know who you're trying to honor. Is it a man or a woman? Is it somebody that's a relative or a friend, someone who works in the corps, a soldier maybe, or an officer in the military? What kind of a person are we trying to honor?" I would think that would be what any smart man that would have risen to that height of being number 2 man in the kingdom would have asked some more questions before he shot off his full mouth. But Haman wasn't that kind of a man. So Haman came in. The king asked him, "What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman is thinking in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let the royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden," 2 things, "and 3, which has the royal crest upon his head. And let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor, and then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim him, 'Thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Thinking it's him. What does that say what he would like to be? He'd like to be the king, I think. And then the king said to Haman, and this is a good one to close on. The king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all you have done." And Haman wasn't stupid enough to refuse the king. And the next verse says he took the robe and he did it. He did it. But think of Haman, who hates this Jew as well as all other Jews, and has a decree passed that they would be exterminated on the 13th of the first month. And he has to lead this man whom he hates through the city, saying, "This is what would be done to the man who the king would like to honor, dressed in all the clothes and finery that Haman would like to be led through the city wearing." God has protected the faithful. God will fulfill the promises that he's made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and in the meantime, he will fulfill the promises he made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their leadership through the years, both to bless when they serve him and to curse when they disobey him. But it is important to remember that's not the promise that God makes for the nation with the church, which is Christ's body. That's a promise that he made with the nation Israel. And for us, we're blessed with every spiritual blessing in heavenly places in Christ Jesus. And I'll pick it up again here this coming Sunday. May the Lord bless you. Goodbye.